So after a thriller of a race last time out in COTA, it was time for another just 1 week later, this time to Mexico and the Autodromo Hermanes Rodriguez for this year's Mexican Grand Prix, a race that without Sergio Perez is usually about as interesting as watching paint dry. Over in the standings and halfway down the order, Aston Martin had closed up to a couple of points behind Alfa Romeo in 6th, helped by a string of great performances and a great result for Sebastian Vettel at COTA. The team would probably have 6th already, but Lance Stroll was a bit too busy forgetting that F1 cars have mirrors. Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to round 20 in Mexico. Before we get going, just a quick reminder that if you are enjoying the content to give it a little thumbs up, and don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications for some more of it later on. Now with that out of the way, let's get into my honest review of Formula 1 and the 2022 Mexican Grand Prix. On to the news now, and first off we had some carryover from last week's race, involving Fernando Alonso, or more specifically his car, after the big collision with Stroll. As post-race, after being allowed to continue with a loose wing mirror, Haas protested that he should have been called in to repair it, with the stewards giving Alonso a 10-second stop-go penalty stating the car should have been repaired and made safe, even though during the race itself there was absolutely zero mention to Alpine that they needed to do so, which is kind of like me asking if it's okay to park my car somewhere, being told by the traffic warden, yeah, that's fine, and then after leaving the car park and heading home, being issued with a parking ticket. And because, as per usual, the incompetence of race control and the FIA was shining through, it meant the matter didn't end there, with Alpine putting in their own protest on the timing of Haas's protest, and so we had protests on protests, with common sense finally prevailing before Mexico and Alonso having his P7 reinstated. But what a mess that was all caused because Lance Stroll can't look in his mirrors. Over at Alfa Romeo, and there was some big news for the future of their team, as come 2022 they'd be taken over by Audi, as the Sauber team would become the works team for the German outfit. So Mercedes, you better be prepared to no longer be the fastest team, and then not even the fastest German one too. Over in Mexico, and it was announced that the Mexican Grand Prix would be staying on the calendar for another few years after extending its contract, meaning we get even more of the ridiculously over-the-top podium celebrations. And finally, over at Mercedes, and Lewis Hamilton had said he was looking at signing a new multi-year extension past 2023, probably because the team are wanting a driver that doesn't just drive into anything that moves. So on to Friday, and believe it or not, there was something more interesting than cars out on the track, which was the news that the FIA had announced the sanctions that were being applied to Red Bull following their breach of the cost cap rules, with one of those being a fine of $7 million, which, when you consider that the team used to spend upwards of $300 million per year, is kind of like fining me or you for some of the spare change we have lying around. But there was another punishment, which was considered the harsher of the two, if you can call either of them that, and that was a reduction in aero testing time by 10%, which is actually 7% compared to the rest of the field, given that Red Bull's success this season has them at 70% of the available testing time for next year. And so, while we'll have to wait to see if it actually makes a difference, as this is F1, there's no way it's going away anytime soon. Into the action though, and we had some rookies. Over at Williams, it was Logan Sargent, who, if things go to plan in F2, will be in the Williams seat for next year. And then at Alpine, they had Jack Doohan in the car, the team surprisingly managing to hold on to a junior driver for a change. Also in was Nick de Vries, having his 1 millionth FP1 session, this time in the Mercedes. And thanks to Carlos Sainz at Ferrari, I think we already have his nickname for next year. All we need is a couple of crashes and boom, welcome to F1, Nick de Vries. Over at Red Bull, and Max Verstappen was showing us that he was actually human, unsettling the car over the curbs and unable to correct the slide, but managing to keep the car from heading into the barriers. Over at Alfa Romeo, and the world's most unreliable car was reminding us all why it's, well, exactly that, as Zhou Guanyu stopped just after the pit exit, unable to shift gears and get his practice start going. Not wanting to be outdone by their Ferrari-powered friends, and the Haas of Fittipaldi came to a halt just seconds later, meaning 2 FP1 sessions in a row had been red flagged by a Haas, though at least this time it wasn't from driver incompetency. And then finally, the attention was on Liam Lawson, who was in for a rookie session at AlphaTauri, as he locked up and went deep at turn 4, but more importantly came to a halt later on in the stadium section, with the brakes catching fire, bringing out the red flag and ending the session. Now onto FP2, and as it was in COTA, we had a Pirelli tyre test, where the teams would have sessions dictated by the tyre manufacturer, and somehow for Charles Leclerc, I don't think stick it in the wall and wreck the back end of your car was in the run plans, as he found himself losing the rear end of the car and spinning off straight into the barriers. Just saying that after last week, this does now put Charles Leclerc on exactly the same level as Antonio Giovinazzi. Over at Red Bull, and Max Verstappen wasn't having the best of times either. I mean, he wasn't just crashing unnecessarily, but still. Going deep at turn 1 and turn 4, along with launching the Red Bull over the curves through the opening few corners. And finally, as is customary in pretty much any session, we had an Alfa Romeo pulled over to the side of the road, with Zhou Guanyu once again coming to a halt, this time with a hydraulic failure that brought an end to FP2 and the day's proceedings. On to Saturday, and first off, in what is the most predictable thing on the planet, it was issues for Zhou's car. Next up, and over at Haas, as has been the case most of the season, it wasn't problems with the car, but with the driver, as Mick Schumacher got caught out by the curbs and spun his hash round, also flat spotting and presumably wrecking a set of tyres. Over at AlphaTauri, and it wasn't plain sailing either, with Pierre Gasly locking up at turn 1 and cutting across the grass as is normally seen here at lap 1 turn 1. And then at Williams it was a similar story, this time Alex Albon with a bit too much speed and taking to the runoff over at turn 4. But onto the session results, and it was surprisingly George Russell P1, with Hamilton just over a tenth behind, and Max Verstappen nearly half a second off the two leading Mercedes. Into qualifying, and it was the backmarkers first on track, confirming the fact that all weekend there was very little grip. Also shown by Max Verstappen, who found himself sliding around for the first sectors of his lap. But despite that, after the first runs he was top, with Ferrari and Mercedes alternating the next spots. On to the end of the session, and Mick Schumacher managed to get out of the drop zone and up into P6, for about 10 seconds, before his time got deleted for corner cutting at turn 2, dropping him back into the danger zone. And despite improving into P15, he was knocked out by Zhou Guanyu, who was the last car to cross the line. Also out were unsurprisingly both Williams cars, and then both Aston Martins. Into Q2, and it was the Mercedes drivers topping the times to begin with, over 2/10 of the car behind, with that car not being Max Verstappen, but Valtteri Bottas, the Finn suddenly remembering how to drive an F1 car and drive it quick. Someone in a bit of trouble was Sergio Perez, in P12 at his home race and needing to improve, and luckily for him he did, going within 7/100ths of P1 and into 3rd and then 5th at the session's end, with the top 4 at the end of Q2 led by Lewis Hamilton and separated by just 14,000ths of a second. Down in the drop zone, and there was a familiar face of Daniel Ricciardo, though I guess at least it was the Q2 drop zone rather than Q1. Also out were both AlphaTauris, along with Magnussen taking an engine penalty, and then Zhou as well. On to Q3, and Sergio Perez went on to provisional pole, because he was the first to set a lap time, and that time was beaten by Verstappen, and George Russell, and also Lewis Hamilton. Except not Hamilton, as he had the lap time deleted for track limits at turn 3. And if you're wondering where the Ferraris are in all this, I could say nowhere, but 4th and 6th separated by Valtteri Bottas is more accurate. On to the final runs, and Perez was first over the line but unable to improve. His teammate Verstappen however could, increasing his gap to Russell to 0.3 of a second. Last across the line were the Mercedes pair, with Hamilton needing to put the time on the board and slotting himself into P3, 5,000ths behind Russell, with George on a good lap but running wide into the stadium section, and after his mistake, that was that, with Max Verstappen on pole for the first time in Mexico and teammate Perez in 4th. And once again, if you're wondering where the Ferraris were, it's still absolutely nowhere, sandwiching Bottas now in 5th and 7th place. So on to Sunday now, and after we'd all finished vibing to the mariachi-style F1 theme, it was time for lights out. But with a long run down to turn 1, would Verstappen be able to hold off the Mercedes behind? Put simply, pretty easily, with Max clear into turn 1 but the Mercedes fighting behind, with Hamilton getting by his teammate and up into P2. And Russell's defence after the race for losing out on the position was that if it had been anyone but his teammate, he'd have just run them off the road. Is that better than drive into the side of them? I guess so. Back to the action, or lack thereof, as we began the phase of the race where nothing happened, also known as the rest of the race. There were a couple of points to note in the midfield though, as in one of the rarer sights on the F1 calendar, Daniel Ricciardo was making an overtake, getting past Zhou Guanyu, with the Australian making some progress after a disappointing start. Behind them, and Pierre Gasly was eager to get past Lance Stroll, employing the George Russell tactic of "I'd just run them off the road" down into turn 4 in order to get past the Canadian, At which point, anybody with eyes and a functioning brain handed Gasly a 5-second penalty for the most blatant forcing another driver off the track we've probably had this year. Now, Pierre could have given the position back, but decided that the penalty was a better option than being stuck behind Lance Stroll. And while in fairness it did kind of work as he pulled away more than 5 seconds on the Canadian, it does put him even closer to a race ban, something even the mighty Nikita Mazepin didn't get. Back to the top teams though, or more accurately in this one the Red Bulls and the Mercedes, given Ferrari's pace had dropped off the face of the earth, but it was time for stops with Perez coming in and Red Bull electing to just chill for an extra 3 seconds. Which meant that when he came out he got caught up behind Leclerc, given that's how slow the Ferraris were. Up ahead, and given the Mercedes cars started on the medium tyres versus Red Bull's softs, they decided to extend their stint, for all of 4 laps compared to Verstappen, as they pulled a Ferrari and boxed for the hard tyres despite every minute of practice pointing to the fact they were useless. Russell, however, did want to extend and change to the softs later in the race, but sadly he's no tyre whisperer and so was called in as well. Which meant with the top teams pitting, it was Verstappen leading Hamilton, leading Perez, leading Russell with the Mercs on hards and Red Bulls on mediums. Perez was just a second behind Hamilton for a couple of laps, but was never able to mount a proper challenge, a bit like Ferrari this year. And for Hamilton, who was told he'd end up catching Verstappen, the gap went from 6 seconds all the way to 14. Not gonna lie, Mercedes did genuinely pull the most subtle Ferrari-style strategy error, and somehow got away with it. Further back, and because the front 4 were more boring than Paul di Resta's voice, it was eyes on the midfield, with Seb Vettel playing God and taking his soft tyres all the way to lap 40 from the start of the race. Sadly for him, the Aston Martin was so slow it made a grand total of no difference to the result. Elsewhere, and there were battles for the last few points between Valtteri Bottas and Esteban Ocon. I say battle, it was more like the Finn just poking around, taking a look and hoping for Ocon to randomly decide to jump out the way. I'm genuinely searching so hard for stuff to talk about in this race that it's come down to Valtteri Bottas pulls out of the slipstream to see if there's an easy overtake. Elsewhere, and thankfully, Daniel Ricciardo was stepping up, both in terms of race pace and in terms of giving me something to talk about, as he came up to the back of Yuki Tsunoda on fresh soft tyres, having already taken his mediums a pretty long way. And not wanting to get stuck behind, he decided to stick a nose up the inside of turn 6, with it not really turning out the best, well for Tsunoda at least, as Ricciardo got through and carried on with no damage. He was given a 10-second penalty, but given he'd miraculously found his pace from about 5 years ago, he went on to clear both Alpines and pulled 10 seconds to Ocon behind. Just a shame that this is all far too late in the day to actually save his F1 career. Talking of the Alpines, and in the case of Fernando Alonso, the cars were doing what they do best, and that's dying, with the Spaniard pulling over at turn 1 and having to retire from the race while in P8 on lap 66 of 71. So there's another few points he can add to his stat of how without reliability issues he'd probably be leading the World Championship. Talking of championships though, and we turn our attention back to Max Verstappen, as after having basically nothing to do for almost 50 laps, he was crossing the line to take win number 14 on the year. It's just a shame the race he did it in was pretty much just Day of the Dead come early. Anyways, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more F1 content. Leave me any thoughts or feedback or even suggestions in the comments down below. But until next time, take care.